Your child isn't ignoring you. They've learned that your words don't reliably predict anything. And there is a very specific difference between those two explanations. Ignoring you sounds like a behavior problem, something to correct with more insistence. Learning that your words don't reliably predict anything is a pattern problem, built, unintentionally, over hundreds of small repeated interactions, and it's fixable with 6 specific shifts, most of which have nothing to do with being stricter. 6 rules. None of them involve raising your voice, and none of them require becoming a stricter parent than you already are. And together they explain why some children respond to a single calm request the first time, while other children, often with parents who are just as loving and just as attentive, seem to require the same instruction repeated 5 or 6 times before anything actually happens. Before we go further, every child, every family, and every temperament is different, and nothing here is a judgment of any parent's approach. This is about consistent patterns researchers have found across families, not a guarantee about any individual child. Stay with me until rule number 6, because number 6 is the one that ties the other 5 together, the underlying reason a child either learns to take a parent's words seriously, or learns, just as reliably, not to. But first, rule number 3 is the one that's going to surprise you, because it directly contradicts a very common parenting instinct, the instinct to repeat an instruction more, not less, when a child doesn't respond the first time. Let's begin. Most of us think about a child not listening the wrong way. We assume it's a matter of getting through to them more forcefully, repeating the instruction, raising the volume, adding more detail or more urgency until it finally lands. Research on child compliance and parent-child communication consistently points somewhere else. A child's responsiveness to a parent's words is shaped less by how forcefully those words are delivered and more by a long accumulated pattern of whether those words have reliably predicted anything in the past. There's a concept in Japanese parenting culture, shitsuke, sometimes translated as discipline but closer in actual meaning to the ongoing, consistent shaping of behavior through modeling, gentle correction, and reliable follow-through, very different from discipline in the punitive sense the word often carries in English. And there's onwayari, consideration, the practiced habit of genuinely attending to another person's internal state, applied here to how a parent attends to what a child is actually experiencing before issuing an instruction, rather than only issuing the instruction itself. 6 rules. Each one shaping the underlying pattern a child is quietly learning about whether a parent's words are worth their full attention. Let's go through every single one. Rule number 1. Connection is established before correction is delivered, physically and attentionally, every single time. You've probably given an instruction from across a room, mid-task, without ever fully turning towards your child or getting down to their eye level first. Stay with me, because this specific gap, instruction without connection, is one of the most consistently cited reasons instructions get ignored, and it has almost nothing to do with the instruction's content. Here's the mechanism. Research on parent-child compliance has found that instructions delivered after a brief moment of genuine physical and attentional connection, getting to the child's eye level, using their name, making sure they're actually looking at you, are followed significantly more often than the identical instruction shouted across a room or delivered while the parent's own attention is split. Part of this is simple attentional filtering. A young child's brain, especially when absorbed in an activity, doesn't always fully register verbal information delivered without a preceding attentional cue. Part of it is relational. An instruction that arrives with a brief moment of genuine connection reads, even to a young child, as coming from someone actually engaged with them in that moment, rather than as background noise competing with everything else already happening. The shift, the same instruction, delivered after a few seconds of genuine eye-level connection instead of shouted from across a room mid-task, is followed considerably more often, not because the words changed, but because the child's attention was actually secured before those words were ever spoken. That is rule number 1. Now, rule number 2 is where this gets interesting, because it addresses what happens after an instruction is ignored, not before it's given. Rule number 2. Consequences are natural or logically connected to the behavior, rather than arbitrary or unrelated. Most instinctive parental consequences are arbitrary, a toy taken away for an unrelated behavior, screen time revoked for something that has nothing to do with screens, chosen in the moment mostly because they're available and effective as leverage, rather than because they connect logically to what actually happened. Here's the mechanism. Research on child development and moral reasoning has found that consequences logically or naturally connected to a behavior, a toy not put away gets put out of reach for the rest of the day, rather than an unrelated privilege being revoked, help a child build an internal understanding of cause and effect specific to that behavior, which supports genuine, internalized learning far more than an arbitrary consequence does. Arbitrary consequences, while sometimes effective at stopping a behavior in the moment, tend to teach a child primarily about parental power and unpredictability rather than about the actual relationship between their action and its result, meaning the lesson doesn't generalize well, and the same behavior is more likely to recur once the specific threatened consequence isn't immediately available. The shift, the same misbehavior, met with a consequence logically connected to the action instead of an arbitrary, unrelated one, produces a child who's actually learning something transferable about cause and effect, rather than a child who's simply learning, in that specific instance, what a parent happened to have leverage over. That is rule number 2. Now, rule number 3, the one I mentioned at the very beginning, the one that goes against a very strong parenting instinct. Stay right here, because this is genuinely counterintuitive. Rule number 3. A request is stated once, calmly, and not repeated, the instinct to escalate through repetition is deliberately resisted. Slow down here, because I know what you're thinking, that repeating an instruction more insistently, especially when the first attempt is ignored, seems like the obvious way to get through to a child. Here's what research on repeated instruction, sometimes studied under the term nagging, has actually found, and why the instinct to repeat works directly against the outcome parents are trying to achieve. Here's the mechanism. When an instruction is reliably repeated multiple times before any actual consequence or follow-through occurs, a child learns, through pure repetition and pattern recognition, that the first several instances of an instruction carry no real weight, only the fourth or fifth repetition, often accompanied by rising parental frustration, actually predicts that something is going to happen. This is a form of learned pattern recognition no different, mechanically, from how any repeated stimulus-outcome pairing gets learned. If the outcome only reliably follows the fifth repetition, the child's behavior calibrates to wait for roughly the fifth repetition, every single time, because that's the pattern that's actually been reinforced. Stating a request once, calmly, and then moving directly to a natural consequence if it isn't followed, rather than repeating the request multiple times first, retrains this pattern. The first instance of the request becomes the only instance that matters, because it's the only one that's ever actually followed by anything. The shift, the same instruction, stated once and followed reliably by a consequence instead of repeated 4 or 5 times with rising intensity, teaches a child that the very first request already carries real weight, while the repeated version teaches, just as reliably, that only the loud, final repetition actually does. That is rule number 3. Now, rule number 4, and this one addresses what has to be true for rule 3 to actually work. Rule number 4. Stated consequences are followed through on every single time, without exception, even when it's inconvenient. This rule is the direct precondition for Rule 3's effectiveness, and it's also one of the most commonly, understandably broken parenting habits, not out of poor intention, but simply because following through consistently is often genuinely more effortful in the moment than letting an empty threat slide. Here's the mechanism. A stated consequence that isn't reliably enforced functions, from the child's perspective, identically to a threat with no real content behind it, and children are, unsurprisingly, quite good at learning which parental statements are reliably backed by follow-through and which aren't, often distinguishing between different specific phrases or even different parents based on this exact pattern. Research on behavioral consistency has found that inconsistent follow-through is one of the strongest predictors of a child's decreasing responsiveness to parental instructions over time, more so than the severity of the consequence itself, which turns out to matter considerably less than its reliability. The shift, the same stated consequence, enforced with total consistency versus enforced only when convenient, produces two completely different long-term outcomes, one where a parent's stated words are treated as reliable information, and one where they're gradually treated as background noise with no dependable connection to what actually happens next. That is rule number 4. Now, rule number 5, and this addresses how instructions are actually framed, not just how they're delivered or enforced. Rule number 5. Small, genuine choices are offered within necessary boundaries, rather than every instruction being delivered as a flat command. Most parental instructions are framed as direct commands: put your shoes on, clean up now, leaving a child with no actual agency in the moment, only compliance or resistance as the available options. Here's the mechanism. Research on autonomy-supportive parenting has consistently found that offering a child small, genuine choices within a necessary boundary, do you want to put your shoes on first or your jacket first rather than simply get ready to leave, produces measurably higher voluntary compliance than a flat command delivered without any element of choice. This isn't about giving a child control over whether the underlying task happens at all. The boundary itself, leaving the house, cleaning up, stays fixed and non-negotiable. What changes is that the child retains a small, genuine sense of agency over how it happens, which research on self-determination theory has found reduces the reflexive resistance that a flat command, offering zero agency at all, tends to provoke. The shift, the same underlying requirement, shoes on, room cleaned, framed as a small choice between two acceptable options instead of a flat command with no agency at all, produces meaningfully less resistance and more voluntary follow-through, because the child is complying with something they had a genuine hand in deciding, rather than simply submitting to an instruction with no input at all. That is rule number 5. Now, rule number 6, the one I told you at the very start, ties all 5 of the others together. Stay here, because this is the most important thing in this entire video. Rule number 6. The behavior being asked of the child is consistently modeled by the parent, not simply instructed. This last rule isn't a separate technique. It's the underlying condition that determines whether the other 5 actually build lasting trust in a parent's words, or simply produce short-term compliance that quietly erodes as the child gets older and more attuned to inconsistency. Here's what I mean. A child asked to speak calmly by a parent who frequently raises their voice, asked to put things away by a parent whose own belongings are scattered everywhere, or asked to listen fully by a parent who's often distracted while the child is speaking, is receiving 2 conflicting sources of information at once, the verbal instruction, and the directly observed behavior of the person giving it. Research on modeling and observational learning, going back to some of the foundational work in developmental psychology, has consistently found that children weight observed behavior far more heavily than verbal instruction when the two conflict, meaning a parent's own consistently modeled behavior is, in a very real sense, a stronger teaching tool than anything they actually say. This is the deeper meaning behind Shitsuk as an ongoing, modeled practice rather than a set of imposed rules. The calm, connected, consistent, and reliable behavior described in rules 1 through 5 isn't just a set of techniques to apply to a child. It has to be the parent's own consistent pattern of behavior first, because a child calibrates their trust in a parent's words largely by watching whether that parent's own actions match them. The shift, the same 5 rules, applied as techniques by a parent whose own behavior doesn't consistently match them, produce a child who eventually notices the gap and adjusts their trust accordingly. Applied by a parent whose own behavior genuinely models what's being asked, the same 5 rules build a durable pattern of trust that doesn't require ongoing enforcement to sustain, because the child isn't just complying with an instruction, they're following an example they've watched hold up, consistently, over years. That is rule number 6. Here is everything in one breath. Establish genuine connection before delivering any correction. Use consequences logically connected to the behavior, not arbitrary ones. State a request once, calmly, and resist the instinct to repeat it. Follow through on every stated consequence, every single time, without exception. Offer small, genuine choices within necessary boundaries instead of flat commands. And consistently model the behavior you're asking for, rather than only instructing it. 6 rules. None of them require becoming a stricter parent, and none of them involve raising your voice more than you already do. Every single one begins with your very next request to your child, whatever it happens to be. A child who's stopped listening usually hasn't stopped caring what you think. They've simply learned, through hundreds of small, repeated interactions, exactly how much weight your words reliably carry, and that pattern, whatever it currently is, was built the same way it can be rebuilt, one consistent interaction at a time. So here's what I want from you before you close this video. Right now, tell me in the comments which one of these 6 is hardest for you personally. Is it number 3, do you find yourself repeating instructions multiple times before anything actually happens? Is it number 4, is there a stated consequence you know you haven't followed through on recently? Is it number 6, is there a gap between what you ask of your child and what they actually watch you do yourself? Tell me the number, 1 through 6, in the comments right now, because naming it is the first step, and someone reading your comment might recognize their own pattern in it and finally decide to change it, starting with their very next request. If this changed how you think about parenting and listening, send it to the one parent you know who's exhausted from repeating the same instruction 5 times a day. They're 6 small shifts away from a child who responds the first time, not the 5th. I'll see you in the next one.